When someone pulls away after hurting you, it is very natural to read that distance as a kind of verdict on your worth. It can easily feel like their silence is proof that what you shared did not matter enough for them to stay, talk, or make things right. That interpretation makes sense emotionally because the nervous system looks for meaning in absence. However, with someone who has an avoidant attachment pattern, that distance is not always a clear statement of disinterest. What looks like emotional shutdown on the surface is often something much more complex underneath. It is not simply about not caring or being detached. More often, it reflects an internal struggle that gets activated when emotions become too intense, too exposing, or too difficult to manage in real time. For an avoidant individual, the moment they realize they have hurt someone does not just bring simple guilt. It often creates a feeling of internal destabilization. It is the sudden awareness that they have caused emotional impact and that now there may be expectations for accountability, repair, or emotional presence. That shift can feel overwhelming rather than grounding. Instead of being able to stay with that discomfort, their system can interpret it as pressure that threatens their sense of control. In those moments, vulnerability stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like something they are being pulled into without preparation. So rather than leaning in to repair the connection, they may instinctively lean out to regain emotional balance. That movement away is often misunderstood from the outside. What looks like indifference is usually an attempt to reduce emotional overload inside themselves. Their mind begins to prioritize relief from tension over engagement with the situation. Thoughts can form that sound logical in their internal world, such as needing space to avoid making things worse, or believing that stepping back will prevent further emotional damage. In this state, distance becomes a form of self-soothing. It is not necessarily a thoughtful decision about the relationship itself, but more of an automatic strategy to bring down the intensity they are feeling. The problem is that while it may reduce their internal pressure temporarily, it does not actually resolve what caused the emotional rupture in the first place. From your perspective, however, that same distance feels entirely different. Instead of relief, it feels like abandonment, confusion, and emotional silence, right when clarity is needed most. You are left holding the weight of what happened, wanting acknowledgement, explanation, or some sign that the connection still matters. When none of that comes, the absence does not feel neutral. It often deepens the original hurt, as if the emotional wound has been left unanswered. This is where the misunderstanding becomes most painful. One person is using distance to regulate internal overwhelm, while the other is experiencing that distance as emotional rejection and disconnection. There is also a deeper dynamic at play where closeness itself becomes complicated for avoidant individuals. Intimacy is not only associated with connection, but also with risk. It can bring up fears of losing independence, being emotionally flooded, or being seen in ways that feel too exposing. When conflict enters the relationship, that closeness can start to feel even heavier because it now carries emotional responsibility along with vulnerability. If someone has not developed the capacity to stay present in that kind of emotional intensity, withdrawal becomes their default protective response. The issue is that this protection is misdirected because the threat is not actual danger, but uncomfortable emotional experience. The irony in this pattern is that the very strategy used to create safety often leads to more disconnection. What begins as an attempt to regain control or avoid emotional overwhelm can unintentionally deepen the separation they are trying to prevent. Many avoidant individuals are not lacking emotion internally, but their external behavior does not always reflect what they feel inside. This creates a confusing dynamic where care may exist, but it is not expressed in a way that supports repair or reassurance. so you are left responding to behavior that feels distant, even when the internal experience may be more conflicted than it appears. Because of this gap between inner experience and outer behavior, it becomes important not to treat distance as a direct measurement of your value or the relationship's worth. Distance is more accurately a reflection of how someone handles emotional stress and responsibility. However, understanding this does not remove the impact it has on you. Even if the withdrawal comes from overwhelm or fear, the result is still lack of communication, absence of repair, and emotional uncertainty. Intent does not cancel impact, so the real focus shifts to what you do with that reality, whether you continue waiting for resolution that may not come, or you recognize the limits of their capacity to engage in emotional repair. Because distance that avoids accountability is not real protection. It only postpones the emotional work that eventually has to be faced, and over time that postponement turns into loss rather than resolution. When you look more closely at this pattern, there is often something else sitting underneath it that is quieter but much more powerful, and that is guilt. Not the kind of guilt that pushes someone toward repair, but a heavier, internalized form of guilt that becomes emotionally overwhelming instead of constructive. Rather than leading to the thought of, "I need to fix this," it shifts into something more self-defeating, like "I am the problem," or "I am someone who only causes harm." And once that identity forms internally, it becomes very difficult to sit with. For someone who relies on emotional control and self-containment to feel stable, that kind of self-perception is deeply destabilizing. So instead of staying close to the emotional reality of what they have done, they begin to distance themselves from it. They create internal explanations that make stepping away feel reasonable, such as believing that returning would make things worse, or that trying to explain themselves would only lead to misunderstanding, or that staying involved would cause them to lose control again. These thoughts are not always fully conscious decisions, but they function as a way to reduce emotional pressure. In that sense, distance begins to feel like the right thing to do internally, even though in reality it is a form of avoidance. True responsibility does not remove a person from the consequences of their actions. It requires them to remain present within them long enough to acknowledge, process, and repair what has been affected. The complexity is that guilt does not simply disappear when someone withdraws. In many cases, it continues to exist in the background, surfacing in quiet moments, memories, or sudden awareness that something remains unfinished. But instead of guiding the person back toward repair, it can actually reinforce the belief that returning is too difficult or emotionally unsafe. The more they associate the situation with failure or emotional overwhelm, the more they avoid re-entering it. This creates a self-reinforcing loop where withdrawal increases internal discomfort, and that discomfort then justifies further withdrawal. From the outside, this can look confusing because many people assume guilt naturally leads to action, apology, and reconnection. In healthier relational patterns, that is often true. But in avoidant dynamics, guilt can stay internal without translating into behavior that repairs the relationship. That gap between internal emotion and external action is where most of the confusion begins. Relationships are not sustained by feelings alone, but by consistent communication, accountability, and the willingness to stay present through discomfort. When guilt remains unexpressed and unprocessed in action, it creates a suspended emotional state where nothing fully resolves. There is no clear closure, but there is also no repair. Instead, everything remains unfinished, and that unfinished emotional space can keep the other person psychologically and emotionally attached to something that is no longer moving forward. You end up waiting for clarity that never arrives, trying to interpret silence that does not offer any real answers, and slowly questioning your own perception of what is happening. In that state, silence stops feeling neutral. It becomes an active absence of repair. Even if there is internal conflict on their side, the external reality for you remains the same. No communication, no resolution, and no emotional completion. And while understanding the psychological reasons behind this behavior can bring clarity, it should not replace your own emotional needs. Awareness is not meant to excuse the lack of action. At a certain point, the explanation matters less than the impact it creates. If guilt leads someone to withdraw instead of repair, then it is no longer functioning as healthy remorse, but as another layer of avoidance. This is where a harder truth becomes visible. Guilt that does not translate into responsibility is not repair, it is retreat. And when someone processes everything internally but remains absent externally, the relationship cannot actually move forward in any meaningful way. What you are left with is emotional knowledge without emotional resolution, which often feels more confusing than clear separation. It keeps you in a space of uncertainty, where you are still trying to interpret meaning from someone who is not actively participating in creating clarity with you. And then there is another layer that often makes this even more difficult to let go of. Even in withdrawal, even in silence, the connection does not simply disappear for them. It changes form rather than ending completely. This is where a difficult reality emerges. Someone can miss you and still not come back. For many people, missing someone naturally creates movement toward reconnection, communication, or repair. But for someone who avoids emotional intensity, that internal feeling does not always translate into action. It remains contained within them, experienced privately, but not expressed outwardly in a way that rebuilds the bridge that was lost. The feeling is strong enough that it does not simply disappear. It gets noticed, revisited, and briefly lived through in quiet moments. They think about what happened between you. They replay conversations. They remember what mattered and what was lost. There is awareness of the connection and there is awareness of absence. But awareness on its own does not automatically turn into action. Because the internal system that caused the initial withdrawal is still operating in the background. The same discomfort with emotional exposure, the same sensitivity to vulnerability, and the same uncertainty about how to repair what was broken remain present. So instead of letting that sense of longing move them back toward reconnection, they hold it internally, where it stays contained rather than expressed. Over time, something subtle begins to change in that inner space. The longing does not disappear, but it shifts form. Instead of becoming behavior, it becomes thought. Instead of leading to contact, it becomes reflection. You slowly stop being experienced as a living part of their daily reality and start becoming something closer to a memory they return to. In that process, idealization can quietly develop. When someone is no longer engaging with the full reality of a relationship, the sharper edges of it naturally soften in memory. The tension fades, the difficult moments lose their emotional weight, and what remains is a more simplified version of the connection. It feels easier to hold because it exists without pressure, without conflict, and without any demand for response or repair. In that internal version, you may no longer appear as the full, complex person you are in real interaction. Instead, you can become a symbol of something meaningful that once existed, something emotionally significant but safely stored away from real consequences. However, even this softened emotional experience does not necessarily push them back toward action, because returning would mean leaving that controlled internal space and stepping back into something real, where unresolved emotions, accountability, and your response would all have to be faced directly. For someone who already struggles with emotional pressure, that step can feel heavier than staying in thought alone. So the connection remains alive internally, but inactive externally. This is where the emotional gap becomes most painful for you. From your perspective, connection is something that exists through presence, communication, effort, and repair when things break. So when someone stays silent, avoids reaching out, and does not take steps toward resolution, it naturally feels like a clear message about your importance. But the reality is often more complicated than that interpretation. It is not necessarily that you lacked value in the connection. It is that the emotional demands of staying engaged with the reality of the situation exceeded their current capacity to handle it. So instead of meeting that complexity, they retreat into a version of the relationship that exists only in their internal world, where nothing is required of them. This creates a split experience. You are dealing with what actually happened, what was said, what needs repair, and what remains unresolved. They are dealing with internal impressions, memories, emotions without immediate consequence, and interpretations that do not require action. These two realities run in parallel but do not meet. One is grounded in lived experience, the other in mental reconstruction. And memory, unlike real-time connection, does not demand accountability. It allows feeling without responsibility and reflection without repair. That is why it can feel like you are holding something real while they are holding something distant and incomplete. Because of this, you are left in a confusing emotional position. On one hand, there is the possibility that they still think about you, still feel something, still recognize the significance of what was shared. On the other hand, there is complete absence in behavior, communication, and repair. Naturally, the mind hopes that internal feeling will eventually become strong enough to overcome avoidance, but emotional intensity alone does not guarantee action. Feeling and readiness are not the same thing, and until they align, external reality does not change. This is why the clarity becomes important, even if it feels uncomfortable. A relationship cannot be sustained through someone's private emotional experience of you. Thoughts, memories, and unspoken feelings do not create stability if they are not expressed through consistent action and presence. Without that, what remains is uncertainty, and uncertainty slowly erodes emotional safety. So even if someone carries feelings internally, if those feelings do not translate into engagement, communication, and repair, they cannot hold the relationship together in any real way. When you step back and look at the full pattern, distance, internalized guilt, silence, and emotional awareness without action, the central tension becomes clear. It is not simply about leaving or staying. It is about an internal conflict that is never fully resolved. One part of them still seeks closeness, connection, and emotional safety. Another part of them associates that same closeness with pressure, vulnerability, and emotional overwhelm. These two forces exist at the same time, creating an ongoing push and pull within them. And instead of working through that tension in a way that leads to resolution, the tendency is to step away from it. That stepping away creates the illusion of relief, but it does not actually resolve the underlying conflict. It only contains it temporarily. What is left unprocessed does not disappear. It tends to resurface in quiet moments, when distraction is low and emotional defenses are not fully active. In those moments, the pull toward reconnection can return, alongside the awareness of everything that would need to be faced if they acted on it. So even within distance, the internal cycle continues between longing and resistance, without ever fully transforming into consistent, outward repair. That is the memory of what would need to be faced, explained, or repaired if they were to step closer again. And because of that, they often end up caught between two emotional realities that both feel real, yet do not align. One part of them moves toward connection, toward what was meaningful and emotionally significant, while another part simultaneously pulls away from it. The result is a kind of suspended state where they are neither fully present in the relationship nor fully detached from it. It feels like being paused between two directions without ever completing the movement toward either side. This is where misunderstandings usually begin. From your perspective, distance tends to look like a clear answer. Absence feels like a decision. It becomes easy to assume that if someone truly cared, they would come closer. If the connection mattered, they would try to repair it. If they wanted you, there would be consistent effort that reflects that intention. This way of interpreting things is natural because most people expect emotions to eventually translate into action. But in this situation, emotional experience and outward behavior are not moving in sync. Feelings may exist, awareness may exist, but something interrupts the process before it becomes steady action or reliable communication. What this creates is not complete emotional absence, but inconsistency. There can be moments of awareness, moments of emotional presence, and moments where the connection is clearly felt internally. However, those moments do not develop into sustained effort or stable engagement. From the outside, this inconsistency feels more confusing than clear absence because it keeps the situation emotionally alive without giving it direction. If there were nothing there at all, the mind would eventually settle into acceptance. But when emotion exists without follow-through, it creates space for interpretation, hope, and ongoing expectation that something might eventually shift. This is also why detachment becomes so difficult. The mind keeps trying to complete a pattern that never fully resolves. It searches for meaning in pauses, silence, and inconsistency, often wondering whether time will eventually lead to clarity or change. But time on its own does not automatically resolve emotional conflict. Distance does not automatically create readiness. Silence does not guarantee understanding. In many avoidant patterns, time actually reinforces the comfort of distance rather than reducing it. The longer the separation continues, the more the nervous system adapts to it as the safer option. The idea of returning then becomes more emotionally loaded, not less, because it gets increasingly associated with pressure, vulnerability, and emotional exposure. Over time, what becomes more familiar is not closeness, but manageability. And manageability is not the same as connection. Something can feel easier to handle from afar without ever becoming emotionally integrated or repaired. This shift is subtle but important because it explains why internal conflict does not automatically move toward resolution. Feeling torn does not guarantee movement forward. Awareness does not guarantee action. Emotional intensity does not guarantee repair. What determines the outcome is whether those internal experiences are translated into consistent, visible behavior that rebuilds trust and stability between two people. And this is where the real distinction becomes clear. Emotional experience can exist entirely within someone without producing external change. It can be strong, real, and present internally, yet still not reach the level of action required to sustain a relationship. Meanwhile, for you, emotional reality is expected to align with behavior. If something is felt, it should be expressed. If something matters, it should be shown. If connection exists, it should be supported through consistent presence. Without that alignment, the relationship becomes unstable because it relies on what is felt but not what is done.